Any decent parent knows that when their children go through that phase of being afraid of monsters under the bed, that it is your job to comfort your children by assuring them that there are no monsters under the bed. I used to tell my daughter that all of the monsters are in Congress and we never let them in our house. I don't think you can start too young to let your kids know that even though there are no monsters under the bed, the world still has monsters. But what about when the family dog dies? How many parents have tried to comfort their children by telling them that their dog has gone to a better place, that he's happier now? And I wonder, should we do that? Of course, if you live in North Dakota, you might try telling them, well, Governor Kristi Noem was driving by and you know how she can be. I'm sorry, I just can't get that one out of my head. But childhood is, by its very nature, full of anxiety. Children are small and vulnerable, and they live in a world full of giants who are grown up, upon whom they are entirely dependent and completely vulnerable. So childhood is marked by imaginary monsters. Their dreams are filled with chasing and falling and fears of isolation or abandonment. Still, I prefer honesty. I think, oddly enough, you could even look at Disney's Lion King on this one. I don't know of any child that was upset when they heard Mufasa explaining the circle of life to Simba. Very honestly, very factually, he explains that we're all connected. The lions eat the antelope, but when lions die, their bodies become the grass, and the antelopes eat the grass. They are in a beautiful connection. It is said that all living things eventually die, but the molecules of our bodies return to the universe where, for all of time, they will reappear in many things: grass and trees, grasshoppers and birds. I don't think with a little kid I would start out with Nietzsche. Kids don't need to hear that death gives life meaning. My undergrad students could never get Nietzsche, so I wouldn't expect a toddler to appreciate him. But honesty, in my estimation, is better than starting off with a delusion that you have to correct later. Such things deserve a lot of delicate compassion, but I just don't think that false comfort is ever a good choice, not for children, and certainly not for adults. Movies often become our modern myths. At one time, when almost everyone in the Western world had a pretty comprehensive education in biblical stories, that common awareness made it possible for us to meet on the ground of shared stories about Noah, David and Goliath, Jezebel, Elijah, and we could be confident that everyone in our audience knew our story. As a biblical scholar, I realized walking through an art museum that a lot of art from 200 and 300 and 400 years ago is easier for me to understand what's going on in the image because I know the biblical stories. In our day, it may be easier to reference The Lion King, The Matrix, or maybe Gone with the Wind, or The Wizard of Oz, and we can talk about those movies with confidence that just about everyone knows the story. Even though they're all fictional, we can make illustrations from characters in those movies and events in those movies. I've often said that progressive religious people have given up false certainty in favor of honest uncertainty. And you can make it sound as if that's a simple thing, but I know it's not easy. That we oftentimes are reared in a religious context in which we have had the anxieties of our childhood set aside by giving security of religious affirmations. Religion can be full of absolutes, the Ten Commandments, dietary laws, rigid sexual boundaries, definitions of marriage, of family, and of charity. But I can remember in grad school a couple of times when students just stood up and left and never came back to class when their confidence in the historical veracity of biblical stories was shaken. We've all known people who at least talked like they took their fundamental religious training at face value, as if it were all historically true, and never allowed themselves, at least consciously, to question it. That, I submit, causes a lot of problems when people take myths too seriously. We watch The Lion King, we can enjoy the story and the music, but we know that lions don't really talk. Sadly, however, a lot of religious people will sit in Sunday school and read about Eve talking to a snake in the Garden of Eden and come away thinking that at least at some time snakes could talk. Several years ago, when the large denominational church where I was the senior pastor was going through some major remodeling, an artist was hired to paint a mural in the church nursery. I wasn't personally involved with any of the details of that, but I did at least stick my head in the door one day as I was walking past to see how the artist was coming along. And the artist had chosen, I assume with the approval of the education committee, to do a mural of the story of Noah's Ark. And I was frozen in my tracks. I can remember when I was a child on the floor of the nursery in Glasgow First Christian Church, that we had a plastic ark with little animals that we put in it. But still, the story of the Great Flood is a horrifying story. God killed billions of people and billions more animals out of regret for having ever made us because we were so undesirable, so bad, but decided to save just a few so that God could start the world over again. We most of us know that this is an echo of a Babylonian story of a great flood, but still, we are so comfortable with this story that we can paint a mural of smiling, happy people and animals who look like they're taking a Sunday afternoon boat ride on the lake. We don't depict all the floating dead bodies all around because at our root, conscious or not, we really know this story isn't true. We know that it didn't happen. We know it won't happen again. So you're painting a mural on a kid's room in a church, so you do something biblical. I might have preferred one of those scenes where Jesus is surrounded by children of different colors, the red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight sort of thing. But this artist went for God's mass genocide of the human race and all of the animals on earth. And if you grew up in one of those churches that was biblically rooted, you undoubtedly knew all the words to the song that children were taught to sing about it. The Lord said to Noah, there's going to be a floody, floody, right? The refrain repeats, rise and shine and give God the glory, glory. But the verses happily recount the building of the arky and the animals coming by twosies. One wonders that children don't have more nightmares about this. It's a horrible story about a monstrous, murdering God. And yet the song ends saying, the sun came out and dried up the landy, and everything was fine and dandy. Forgive me, but we're all outraged about Kristi Noem shooting her dog, but we teach our children to sing a happy song about God killing 99.999% of the people in the world? I hope you're not offended if I ask what the actual hell would make us think that this is a children's story. I trust that you can see we wouldn't tolerate this narrative for a moment around our children unless we already realized that it just wasn't true. In the ancient world, it was horrifying and not subtly threatening. But since it's pure fiction, we tend to think that we can do whatever we want with it. No one really takes it seriously. It's just that unless you attend a Unitarian church, you've probably never heard a minister say out loud that it just didn't happen. A decent preacher will use stories of these grand divine events described in the Bible, the dividing of the Red Sea, the stories of Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, even the miraculous feeding and raising of the dead stories in the prophets. We use those not to recount history, but to teach moral lessons. I don't think many preachers will add the footnote of reminding the congregation that these are ancient myths, not matters of historical fact. But I hope that most people reach that conclusion on their own, even if it isn't blatantly pointed out to them. We don't live anymore in an age of myths and fables. We have more than our share of embarrassing conspiracy theories, but we are influenced in every aspect of our lives by the modern age of science, which has trained us to be more fact-literal about the world. Whereas people in the ancient world did not tell and retell these ancient myths as if they thought they were literal history, they knew better. But unfortunately, modern people tend to turn off their critical thinking when it comes to religion. We don't tend to read ancient myths for their moral lessons, which is why they were written in the first place. At least some religious people want to put them on the same shelf as in the library as their history and their biology textbooks. We see this being played out in state legislatures all over the red states in the United States, certainly here in Florida. Science gives us a different kind of what I think could be called faith. I have a very amateur interest in physics. I regret that in all my years in college, I didn't take more formal training in physics, but I love to try to catch up with new discoveries when someone is kind enough to break it down into layman's terms and publish it. A friend recently sent me a link to an article about the possible discovery of a tiny particle that they are currently calling the glue ball. At a subatomic level, the universe is believed to be made up of only 12 particles of matter that are held together by 4 forces of nature: gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak force and the strong force, which accounts for most of the behavior of atoms, but not everything. The reason why there are particle colliders around the world is so that physicists can try to break atoms apart and find these particles. They don't usually last long. Once the small parts of an atom are broken up, these elements disappear quickly, but they try to detect the existence of the particles and the forces that control them. The Beijing spectrometer number 3 appears to be especially good at breaking down to the meson particle, which is made of a charm quark and a charm antiquark. It is in observing these particles, which disappear almost instantaneously as soon as they're observed, this is where physicists think they may have found the glue ball that helps to hold uncharged particles together in the nucleus of an atom. Now, I can read this research with a kind of childlike wonder, but isn't this another kind of faith? I don't understand it. I have no idea how particle colliders work, nor would I know what a charm quark or a meson was if a bunch of them just suddenly stood up in my soup. I have a tiny bit of knowledge, just enough to give me tremendous respect for the theorists and the physics researchers who investigate these things. And I'm willing to give them a whole lot of room to declare that most of the universe is made up of dark matter, even though no one's ever seen dark matter and no one knows what it is. We just know that there must be an awful lot of it because of the gravitational pull. The universe is expanding at an accelerating rate when you would think it would be slowing down. So there must be an awful lot of gravitational pull from outside that is making the universe spread apart faster. Now, in my daily life, I see evidence of gravity. I can see electromagnetism at work. But I have to take it on my confidence in scientists that there is such a thing as a weak force and a strong force that operate at the subatomic level. I can't see it, I can't watch it happen, but I accept that atoms do appear to stick together, and if the weak force and the strong force is making our existence possible, then I'm grateful. Science attempts to learn what is true about the universe, but you have to be aware that science is morally neutral. The myths and fables of religion were never intended to tell us about physics or history, but they were intended to teach morality, to teach us how to live, how to choose to show compassion, how to live in a way that creates a civilization in which both love and justice might flourish. Now, I think that Karen Armstrong is the most comprehensive and almost impossibly well-informed religious scholar alive today. I highly recommend all of her books to you, but just be aware if you rush out to buy some, it's a bit like trying to drink from a fire hose. She writes really thick books and puts an awful lot of information in it, and you have to really concentrate to get a lot out of it. But she said about religious myths, the myths and laws of religion are not true because they conform to some metaphysical, scientific, or historical reality, but because they are life-enhancing. They have truth in them, even though they're not historically or scientifically true. She says, they tell you how human nature functions, but you will not discover their truth unless you apply these myths and doctrines to your own life and put them into practice. As a progressive preacher, I keep trying to liberate religious people from taking ancient myths literally to save them from the moral pitfalls that are inevitable when people try to think that way. The constant wars between the extremists of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, these wars are oftentimes the result of really bad theology, largely rooted in trying to take these myths at face value. And though we don't hear much about it in the West, there have also been some horrible, bloody conflicts between Hindus and Buddhists, more rare among them to be sure, but just look up the Black July massacre for one example of when things went really crazy. Religion at its best helps us to be better people so that we can create a better society. Religion, however, that is mired in superstition and magical thinking actually causes a lot of the problems that we face in the modern world. Pope John Paul II once wrote to the director of the Vatican Observatory sometime in the late 1980s. Pope John Paul said, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both of them can flourish." I think it's always been a mistake to think that science replaces faith or that faith has to resist scientific education. In the best of all possible worlds, science and faith help to guide one another. The critical thinking skills and devotion to reality inherent in science can help religion to clean house, to examine our myths and free us from the grand moral failures which we have to admit have cursed the human race for centuries. Similarly, the devotion to compassion and justice that is inherent in sincere spirituality can help to keep science from reducing life to a kind of nihilism. We only have to think about the horrors of experiments that have been conducted on human beings to recognize that science needs moral boundaries. Now, I've used this illustration before, but please allow me to repeat it once more. I had to leave it behind when I moved from Missouri to my new home in Florida, but this ficus tree you see pictured here stood in my living room for nearly 40 years. I had to move it outside every summer and managed to wrestle it back inside every fall, year after year, and it had become nearly impossible to move it. On the right, you see me pictured with my lovely Korean daughter, whom I adopted 35 years ago. Both my daughter and the ficus tree are comprised of the same 12 particles of matter, and those atoms are held together by the same 4 forces of nature. Their atomic composition is actually very similar. They even weigh about the same. They are both made up of atoms formed billions of years ago in exploding stars. But that's where the similarity ends. I cared for, fed, and raised both of them, the tree and my daughter. But there is a huge difference in how I feel about them, right? Physics can describe them atomically, but physics cannot measure the love that I feel for my daughter. Science can describe what is, what exists, what the substance of a thing is, but spirituality brings meaning to the equation. I don't exist in a universe of atoms alone. My life is in relationships, connections to people and to nature that is defined by awe, wonder, love, and hope. Now, I'm a pastor who does not believe in a literal heaven or hell. I don't believe in souls or angels, and I don't have a belief in a supernatural theistic person who lives in the clouds, who sometimes grants our wishes, but most of the time doesn't. And that upsets an awful lot of people. But I assure you, I am deeply religious. Not as defined by a matter of beliefs or rituals or creeds or sacraments, but in a passion for justice and a deep love and hope for humanity and for the earth. I deeply regret that conservative Islam and conservative Judaism teaches children in Israel and Gaza that God actually wants them to kill each other. Just as I hate that Christians and other world religions allow their superstitions to justify the oppression of women, condemning homosexuals, dividing races, and the exclusivism that makes us value our religion and despise others, which even justifies our indifference towards the suffering of others. I'll charge you to notice when there's a news report about a catastrophe like the terrorist attack from Gaza into Israel, they immediately turn to how many Americans were involved. If a plane goes down, if a ship sinks, we don't appear to have a lot of compassion if they are Indonesian citizens or if they are even from Europe. We want to know that they were more like us. I'm going to close with one more quote from Karen Armstrong, and this one is my favorite. If your understanding of the divine made you kinder, more empathetic, and impelled you to express sympathy in concrete acts of loving kindness, this was good theology. But if your notion of God made you unkind, belligerent, cruel, or self-righteous, or if it led you to kill in God's name, it was bad theology. Let's use our critical thinking to interrogate our myths as we strive to become better people. I realize that traditional religious folks may find it a lot easier to give up on Old Testament myths than using the same interrogation skills on the Jesus narratives in the New Testament. Still, that may be the more important work for us as we grow past the beliefs of the religion that we learned as children. So I'll be talking about the limitations of what we actually know about Jesus in my talk that will be posted on June 2nd. I'll look forward to joining you then.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.